We like to think of history as a solid thing, a collection of facts locked in a vault. But history isn't really a vault, it's more like a crime scene. And depending on which detective you hire, the truth of what happened changes completely. Each investigator brings their own baggage, their own biases, their own specialized tools to the scene, often highlighting one piece of evidence while completely stepping over another. If you want to understand why we fight about statues, school curriculums, and even the news today, you have to understand what's called historiography. That's the study of how we write history. It's not just about what happened, but about who told the story and why they chose that specific narrative arc. Today we're looking at 5 of the primary lenses that shape our world and dictate our collective memory. Now, these are not the only schools of thought, and there are many sub-schools and nuances and depths to each of these, but these 5 give us a decent understanding of the politics of truth. First up is the great man theory. This is the classic, and this school says that history is driven by heroes with a capital H. Bold, singular individuals whose sheer will bends reality. If Napoleon isn't born, the map of Europe stays the same. If Churchill doesn't stand firm, the world falls to darkness. It's a great story, but it's a bit lonely. It creates a cult of personality that forgets the millions of people who actually marched in the mud, worked the factories, and sustained the movements these leaders claim to own. So in the early 20th century, we get the progressive lens. Progressives believe history is a ladder. We're always climbing toward more freedom, more democracy, and more science. It's the Whig view. The idea that the past was just a rough draft for our glorious present, an inevitable march toward enlightenment. It feels good and offers a sense of purpose, but it often ignores the people we stepped on to get to the next rung, and it dismisses past cultures as merely primitive versions of ourselves. Then things got cynical. Enter Marxist historiography. The Marxists don't care about your great men or your liberty. They care about the wallet. They argue that every war, religion, and law is just a cover story for class struggle. To a Marxist, the truth isn't in a stirring speech about freedom, it's in the ledger of who owns the land and who does the labor. They see history as a series of economic shocks and power grabs by those at the top against those at the bottom. But as always, there's a French twist, the Annales school. These historians looked at the deep time. They argued that a king's 20-year reign is just a ripple on the surface of a vast ocean. The real truth is the geography, the climate, and the slow, agonizingly gradual change of that environment. If the soil is rich, you get an empire. If the rains fail for a century, the civilization collapses regardless of who sits on the throne. This is history from the earth up, where nature is the primary protagonist. And finally, we hit the modern era, postmodernism and social history. This is history from below. Postmodernists ask probably the hardest question of all: whose truth? They argue that most of our history was written by the winners, for the winners, to justify their winning. They look for the silences in the archives, the conquered, the women, the enslaved, the marginalized, the workers, and the outsiders. To them, truth isn't a single straight line. It's a million overlapping, often contradictory voices that challenge the very idea of a universal story. Now here's the secret, in my opinion. None of these schools are right, nor are any of these schools wrong. But every one of them is useful. Let's take the Industrial Revolution. The great man guy says it's about James Watt and his steam engine. The Marxist says, no, it's about capital accumulated from the slave trade and the exploitation of the working class. The Annales scholar says, look at the coal deposits in Britain. Geography is destiny. And the progressive says it's a triumph of human ingenuity. But the postmodernist asks, what did the 10-year-old girl in the textile mill think about ingenuity? When you put them together, the truth starts to look like a 3D hologram. You realize that James Watt needed the coal, which was mined by a specific class, fueled by a belief in industrial science, and experienced differently by every person involved. By layering these perspectives, we move away from flat, one-dimensional propaganda and toward a much richer, albeit messier, understanding of our shared human experience. Now, all of this may sound like something that is often spoken of with derision, and that is revisionism, or revisionist history. But revisionist history is simply the act of looking at the way history is taught with a different lens. In the US, for example, revisionism is often looked at as sort of a progressive or leftist attempt to rewrite the history that is typically taught, which historically has been about patriotic great men. But any new way of thinking can be revisionist. The Annales would focus on geographical and environmental causes of 18th and 19th century French history, but a revisionist could easily take a Marxist approach, or even a great man approach, to argue that the environment wasn't nearly as important as Louis XIV or Napoleon. And, oh boy, the different schools of thought around the depictions of Jesus? Well, those are so numerous and diverse that they deserve their own separate video. Suffice it to say, the depictions vary wildly based on who's making the art and why. Revisionism isn't always about one philosophy or another. It's simply about looking at accepted historical theories through a different lens. So why does this matter to our discussion of the politics of truth? Because today, people are still using these lenses to manipulate us. When a politician says, "Only I can fix this," they're using the great man lens to make you feel powerless and dependent. When a corporation says, "Economic growth is the only metric that matters," they are using a stripped-down Marxist lens to ignore your humanity and reduce you to a data point. When people say, "That's just the way it's always been," they are weaponizing Annales-style deep time to suggest that change is impossible, and you should just accept the status quo. Knowing these lenses means you can see the frame. And once you see the frame, you can decide if you want to look through it. Look, history isn't just about the past. It's the tool, or sometimes the weapon, that we use to build the future. The stories we tell ourselves today dictate the laws we pass tomorrow and the societies we choose to build. So the next time you hear a truth about where we came from, ask yourself, who's holding the camera? What is their motive? And most importantly, what are they leaving out of the shot in order to make their point?